war in Iran has put a chokehold on oil from the Middle East, but Russia has oil, and selling it to hungry markets across the globe would help fund its war in Ukraine.
The Ukrainians aren't just going to sit back and let that happen.
I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Today, Ukraine confronts new realities on the world stage. Also, demand for renewable energy as countries looking to one place for cheap green tech.
China decided that it wanted to become a leader in manufacturing things like EVs, solar panels, batteries, wind turbines.
How that's working in China's favor.
And Mexico is gearing up for the World Cup, which means getting ready for the appetites of fans.
They consume drugs. They demand sex.
What that means for Mexico's cartels.
All that and more today here on The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Thank you for coming along this Wednesday. Ukraine is on the verge of getting an infusion of aid from the European Union to the tune of $106 billion. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says it's crucial.
It's really the question of our life, of the surviving, of defending. So we need this money very much.
The holdout on European aid for Ukraine had been Hungary under the leadership of Viktor Orban, but he was recently voted out of office. This is just one piece of the geopolitical puzzle right now for Ukraine. We begin today with Philip Payson O'Brien, a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He is also the author of a recent article in The Atlantic titled "Ukraine Has Finally Given Up on Trump."
It's absolutely vital for the Ukrainian economy to keep the war going, that the United States has dropped off the map. The United States doesn't help Ukraine in any way in terms of aid now. It sells a very small number of weapons via European countries, but we don't even know if that's going to continue because the U.S. is running down its own stockpiles. So if Ukraine is going to get supported now, it's going to have to come from European states, its friends in the European Union in particular. And that aid has been blocked for a while by Hungary, Viktor Orban, who was working very closely with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Right. He's out now. So the hope is now that with Orban gone, the European Union can move forward with this loan that they proposed months ago, but which the Hungarians have held up.
Yeah, so this loan is expected to be signed off on Thursday. What will this money allow Ukraine to do? It's about energy and oil, isn't it?
It's keeping the economy functioning. Ukraine has now quite a productive war economy, but it doesn't create the money to keep it going. So it has the ability to make a large number of UAVs, drones, and another key components of its military system. It's got to pay its workers. And it's not generating the money that it would have normally made from civilian resources. So to keep the economy functioning, it needs this outside currency. It's absolutely vital. Europeans know that. And that's why this has been in the pipeline for a while. It's just been held up by pro-Putin governments.
Well, you had an inadvertent pun there because there is a key oil pipeline that runs through Ukraine, and that's damaged, right?
It's damaged. This is actually an old Soviet-era pipeline which ran through Ukraine when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and it's how some Russian oil gets to Europe. There's been a lot of fighting over it because it's an odd situation to think that the Russians are selling oil to places like Hungary and Slovakia by shipping it through Ukraine, even though Russia and Ukraine are at war. This pipeline was damaged. There's been some questions about how it got damaged. Now, though, it is said to be back working, and that is one of the final steps to make sure the Hungarians support this loan.
It is a dilemma for Zelensky because Russian oil flows through Ukraine to places like Hungary next door and Slovenia, and they've accused Zelensky of holding back oil supplies. All of this is complicated, of course, by the war in Iran and the hike in oil prices. Recently, Russian oil seems to have started flowing to parts of Europe again, but the flow is tentative. Do you see a full return of Russian oil to Europe?
No. It's not going to go fully back to that. Europe will face a real dilemma. I mean, that Trump's attack on Iran has not damaged America's oil situation because the United States exports oil, but it's really put Europe in a bind. Europe has not been buying Russian oil. It's really tried to downsize that, but it has had to buy its oil, a lot of it from the Gulf. And the United States went to war with Iran without consulting its European allies and basically said to them, well, you deal with it. And Europeans are really in a problem. Now, they don't want to buy Russian oil, so they're going to try and they'll probably have to buy more. Some of them will buy more. We don't know exactly how that will work. But they're also going to buy oil from the United States now. So the United States, oddly, is going to get oil sales because of its own decision to attack Iran, to put Europe in a real strategic bind, and they will have to get oil from a number of different places. But they won't go back to what they were doing before 2022.
Is Ukraine now sort of incentivized to maintain Russian energy flows, despite the fact that Kyiv needs to further isolate Moscow?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Ukraine is now going after Russian oil exports. If you've been since Trump attacked Iran, which has been a huge windfall for Vladimir Putin, that what Trump did in attacking Iran was lead to a 50-60% jump in the price of oil. Plus, it meant that there were no Russian discounts anymore. Everybody needed oil. So, I mean, it was a godsend for Putin what Trump did. And at that point, the Ukrainians, interestingly, decided to take the gloves off, and they went after Russian oil exporting. So they attacked a number of major facilities on the Baltic near St. Petersburg that they hadn't really attacked before. They went back, and they've recently been hammering Russian export facilities on the Black Sea. So I think the Ukrainians are like, look, we're not going to blow this pipeline up that goes across our territory, but we're not going to let the Russians export to everybody because Russian income basically doubled overnight from these oil sales, maybe even more than doubled. So the Ukrainians aren't just going to sit back and let that happen, which is why this oil war is very intense.
Where does all this leave relations between Kyiv and Washington? Like, could the EU loan replace lost U.S. funding, or is there still a huge gap, especially on the military aid front?
From the moment Trump became president, U.S. aid ended. I mean, J.D. Vance was boasting about that the other day. The Europeans cannot replace American weapons so easily, but they can replace American money. So the money isn't actually the problem, it's the weapons. And this $90 billion loan will be very important to keep the Ukrainians going. We'll probably keep them going for more than a year. Where the Europeans will struggle is they can't make certain advanced weapon systems, such as the Patriot anti-air missiles, which are really important in shooting down the most advanced Russian missiles. So the replacement of the United States isn't a monetary question, it's a weapons question. This money will replace American money, but they're sure going to have to find some way to help elements such as Ukrainian air defense.
Yeah, on the weapons front, I mean, we know Ukraine has been pleading with the U.S. for more weapons in its fight against Russia. Trump and many Republicans have been reluctant so far. But how much is that story right now one about supply and demand, with the U.S. needing its weapons to conduct this war on Iran with Israel?
Well, I mean, this war against Iran has been incredibly profligate for the United States. They have just been using up stocks of weapons at almost historic rates. I mean, they've been firing Tomahawks, so many of their anti-air systems. So in that sense, yes, they've blown through stocks and they have very little to send to Europe. But I mean, I think also they just don't want Ukraine to have it. That the Trump administration has been really slow walking sales to Ukraine. What little they've been sending is a form of leverage. And that's what you have to see it as. They've been keeping a little leverage over Ukraine because ultimately they want Ukraine to take a bad deal. They want Ukraine to take a deal that Vladimir Putin wants, to give him the Donbass. And they figured the only way to keep that leverage is to let Ukraine have some weapons. So that's how this has worked out to this point. The Ukrainians at this point seem to calculate that the United States is not their friend, that the United States has moved to being much closer to Russia, and that is just the reality they face. So the Ukrainians are thinking more and more about how they fight this war without any kind of American assistance, on the assumption that really is now what they're facing.
Well, Phillips, your Atlantic article is titled "Ukraine Has Finally Given Up on Trump," and you say Zelensky has written off the U.S. as a reliable partner. Can Ukraine afford, though, to completely turn its back on active engagement with Washington?
Well, it could still remain engaged and have diplomatic relations. It just has to plan on not getting anything from the U.S. in terms of arms sales. And yes, it can. I mean, this is a horrible war, but the Ukrainians have learned to be resourceful and adapt and deal with what they have to deal with. It won't be easy on the high end, then that's in terms of shooting down the most advanced Russian missiles. Then they will struggle with that with no Patriots. But it also, in some ways, this is the other thing, it frees them a little bit because they've been very deferential for years towards the United States. And the Americans are saying, don't attack these oil facilities, don't attack these long-range targets. So the Ukrainians might compensate for their own now defensive problems by being more offensive and going after vital economic targets they hadn't actually hit before.
What have you noticed recently about President Zelensky's tone in addressing President Trump? Is it evolving from that deferential taking it on the chin moment at the White House last February when he was dressed down by Trump and J.D. Vance?
Absolutely, the tone has changed, particularly in the last 10 days. And if you look at what Zelensky's saying, he's basically looking towards Europe and saying to Europe, wake up. The United States isn't there anymore. The United States isn't going to ride to your rescue. We are in this together. And by that, he means Europeans. And Ukraine is therefore very important to your security. And the Europeans are understanding that too, that with the United States being totally unreliable, and it is, and the United States being closer to Russia, Ukraine becomes very important for Europe's future. And that's what Zelensky's saying. And he's not afraid to say out loud to the Europeans, all right, let's imagine our security without the USA because the USA can't be trusted. And the fact that he would say that kind of thing out loud is very important. He would never have said it even probably a month ago.
You know, most people have been surprised at Ukraine's ability to fend off Russia all these years. Zelensky is now pivoting away from the U.S. for reasons you've just been discussing. Mm-hmm. I'd love to know your thoughts on Zelensky as a war strategist. What stands out to you?
He's been a brilliant messenger. And by the way, internally in Ukraine, he has still a significant amount of support, but there's some, I think, grumbling about him internally, about whether he has this old crony system. He had obviously been backing people, some of whom seem to engage in some corrupt practices. So we don't want to make Zelensky out to be a faultless war leader. But what he is brilliant at is messaging. And that is from the moment the Russians crossed the border to now. Zelensky has a way to articulate his nation's needs that not many war leaders in the past could have done in the way he's done. From the first moment when he basically said to the U.S., no, I'm going to stay, I'm going to fight, I need ammunition, not a ride, to last week where he said to the Europeans, now it's time to stand up. He can say in this modern media age, quite short, punchy, effective messages to get that across. So he's very, very good internationally. I think domestically, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. But ultimately, Ukrainians do see him as their war leader, and they're going to back him for now.
Phillips Payson O'Brien is a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
It is not just Zelensky. Another world leader is at the end of his rope with the U.S. In a speech on Sunday, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney said this to his nation from Ottawa.
Many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become our weaknesses that we must correct.
Carney went on to say that the world is more dangerous and divided as a result of the current administration in Washington. He also reminded Canadians of Trump's tariff hike that levied U.S. taxes on Canadian goods to levels not seen since the Great Depression.
In his 10-minute address, Carney listed his government's efforts to strengthen Canada's economy, attracting new investment, signing trade deals with other countries, chipping away at trade barriers within the country, and he spoke directly to critics of what he's calling his Canada Strong initiative.
They believe we should wait it out in the hope that the United States will return to normal, that the good old days will come back. But hope isn't a plan, and nostalgia is not a strategy. We have to take care of ourselves because we can't rely on one foreign partner.
The speech was both a rebuke to the U.S. and something of a manifesto in its own right. Jamie Gillies is a political scientist at St. Thomas University. Speaking to the CBC, he said Carney may be taking advantage of what he sees as a low point in Trump's presidency.
Trump's poll ratings and support in the United States have declined a lot this year, and maybe he sees some possibilities where Canada can go on the offensive as we get into what we think is going to be sort of some long-term trade negotiations with the U.S. on a larger trade and strategic plan, perhaps over the next 6 to 8 months.
So far, no response from the Trump administration. You're with the world.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Elections are supposed to give people a say in who governs their country, but natural disasters, from floods to heat waves, can also have an impact on the election process. In the last 20 years, nearly 100 elections and referendums around the world have been affected by natural hazards. About a quarter of these disruptions happened in 2024 alone. That is according to a report out today from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Erik Asplund is one of its authors and spoke with me earlier today from Stockholm.
Primarily what we're finding is that the impact is on electoral integrity in terms of participation. So with events such as wildfires, floods, heat waves, this could obviously, as you understand, have a big impact on access to polling stations. Also, these events are very disruptive because we can see a lot of people who are forced to move to other locations, and as a result, where they're not registered.
So mostly the impact has been that some people were not able to vote or had more trouble voting because of these natural disasters.
Sure, but I mean, registration is a big deal. So if people can't register, that to some extent, of course, disenfranchises them, right? So we do have cases such as in Mozambique, where they experienced two cyclones. Cyclone Ida, which took place in March 2019. After that cyclone, 3,200 classrooms were destroyed. And these classrooms were used for voter registration and voting. So you can imagine that this caused a huge problem for the Election Commission. They had to postpone registration for 15 days. And that also obviously created a problem in terms of actually getting the amount of people registered that they actually wanted to.
Can you give me a couple more examples of when natural disasters have impacted elections or their outcomes?
Yeah, of course. A couple come to mind. The Bosnia-Herzegovina, they had floods and landslides during the 2024 local elections, where they had to postpone elections in 4 municipalities. We also have Canada, where you saw wildfires in Alberta, and also in the Northwest Territories, where they actually had to postpone the elections for 6 weeks.
Wow.
You also have heat waves in India during the 2024 national elections, which resulted in the death of polling officials. You have other cases of heat waves in the Philippines and Mexico ahead of elections. You also have the case of the US, wildfires in California ahead of elections. You have hurricanes on a regular basis. Hurricane Milton and Helene obviously come to mind.
It strikes me that 2024 was this huge election year around the world, a lot of national elections. And it was also, to that point, the hottest year on record with some very wild weather. So it was kind of a perfect storm for weather impacts on electoral processes, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, based on the data that we have to date, we know that in 2024 alone, extreme weather disrupted 23 elections in 18 countries.
Wow.
Yes, that might also be because it was a supercycle year, of course, but that does seem to be a lot. And even when I'm looking at the data that we have over time, so between 2006 and 2025, we know that 52 countries have been affected by extreme weather and other natural hazards in 94 elections and referendums. So still, it is quite worrisome.
What's the biggest message that you hope election officials would take away from your research?
So I hope the book provides both a case in terms of why we should start thinking about extreme weather in terms of elections, but also empowers them to some extent in terms of what other election commissions have done to protect elections.
Does this worry you, or do you think that officials are up to the task of making elections more resilient in the face of climate change and other threats?
It only worries me in the sense that if we're not able to identify the risks, right? So now what we try to do is identify the risks and the threat of extreme weather at a global level. But then it's really up to the election officials in each country to start doing some kind of risk management. What I'd also love to see is this building of communities of practice, because, I mean, we have an elections community, we have a disaster risk community, we have a climate community. And I think to some extent, there needs to be more collaboration between these three communities to understand the risks of extreme weather events are going to have on elections.
Erik Asplund is with the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We reached him in Stockholm.
We can tell a lot about what's going on in nature based on what we see. A yellow daffodil means it's spring. Bear tracks in the dirt mean, yeah, you're in their habitat. Take a different path. With summer around the corner, we wanted to go back to a story reporter Bianca Hillier brought us a couple of years ago. It's about what the sounds of nature can tell us, sometimes in places where we simply expect silence.
Standing out in my garden, I can hear a lot of things going on. Birds are chirping, bees are buzzing. What I can't hear with my naked ear, though, is the sound of the soil. But if I stuck my microphone into the dirt, it might sound something like this.
We're calling them cracks and pops and stuff, and it's pretty alien sounding.
Alex Taylor studies ecology at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. His team recently published new research that uses super-sensitive microphones to listen to and analyze different kinds of soil. When they listened to healthy and biodiverse soil,
you see this rise in diversity of sound, the complexity of sound. You can imagine a worm wriggling its way through soil. Water is moving through it and air is moving through it. The millipedes and the ants, every time their legs sort of tap and tap and tap, they're moving soil around and it's all creating vibrations and sound.
Taylor's team also listened to unhealthy soil, which can be a result of deforestation, mass urbanization, overgrazing, and other destructive practices. That soil sounded very different. Unhealthy soil is nearly silent because there aren't as many critters in there moving around.
Silence in a soil soundscape would be pretty sad.
And yet, that's what the majority of soil could sound like. A recent UN report says 75% of the Earth's soils are degraded. That number is expected to rise to 90% by 2050 if current trends continue. Taylor says being able to determine soil's health by listening to it replaces traditional methods, which are expensive, disruptive, and laborious, requiring scientists to manually sift through the soil.
Results strongly support for sure that it's just as effective as the traditional methods.
The new findings add to a field of research called ecoacoustics, which is the study of sounds produced by animals, plants, and their environment. Ecoacoustics has been used to study animals like bats, birds, and frogs, but using it to determine the health of soil is new. Taylor says the findings could help inform policy on environmental management.
As a hypothetical, you've got a local council that is wondering where they need to put their efforts, and a park ranger can go out and use ecoacoustics and say, hey, look, this supercritical river bank has super unhealthy soils. We're going to need some funding. That's kind of the end goal.
Taylor and his team conducted their ecoacoustics research in Australia's grassy woodlands and the UK's temperate forests. More research will need to be done to see how the technique would work in other ecosystems and whether it would be as effective. For The World, I'm Bianca Hillier.
More global stories coming your way. Stick around. You're listening to The World.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. This week, a mass shooting hit Mexico's Teotihuacan site. One Canadian visitor died and at least 12 others suffered injuries, leaving the country and tourists in a state of shock. This just weeks before Mexico co-hosts the Soccer World Cup. The incident has raised questions about security for the millions of fans who are expected to attend matches in 3 cities across Mexico. From Mexico City, The World's Tuvisa Isaiah reports.
Millions of visitors come every year to Teotihuacan, just outside Mexico City, to climb its massive pyramids and take in sweeping views of one of the largest ancient cities in the Americas. But on Monday, this iconic site became a crime scene.
Aquí tengo rehenes. Y como intenten subir, los voy a matar.
That's a 27-year-old man making threats moments before opening fire on visitors at one of the pyramids. Authorities say he acted alone and had planned the attack in advance. His motive is still unclear, but investigators say he may have been inspired by violent attacks abroad including the Columbine school shooting, which took place on the same day 27 years ago.
Este hecho tan lamentable, pues nunca había ocurrido en una zona arqueológica de nuestro país.
Mexico's security chief Omar Garcia Harfuch said there's never been a shooting at a Mexican archaeological site before. Lone gunman attacks like this are rare in Mexico, in part because legal access to firearms is tightly restricted. Most weapons are illegally trafficked from the U.S. by cartels.
No hay arcos de seguridad en los sitios arqueológicos. Nunca ha habido. ¿Por qué? Porque no se habían presentado estas situaciones.
President Claudia Sheinbaum acknowledged there is no security screening at Mexico's archaeological sites. She's now ordered more security personnel and stricter controls at major tourist sites. The attack comes at a sensitive moment because in June and July, Mexico will co-host the Men's Soccer World Cup, and the country is expecting millions of visitors. Security officials say they have been preparing for months. General Román Villavalso is leading the plan.
Muy buenos días. Señores, la Copa Mundial de Fútbol 2026.
At a recent press conference, he outlined a deployment of nearly 100,000 security personnel to protect stadiums, fan zones, hotels, and transit hubs.
Una seguridad inmediata, lejana, y en algunos casos tendrá un cuarto cinturón de seguridad que llamamos refuerzo.
He says the idea is to build rings of security, including surveillance, patrols, and systems to stop unauthorized drones. Security is an ongoing issue in Mexico. 2 months ago, an operation to capture cartel leader El Mencho caused violence in Jalisco, also a World Cup host state, including roadblocks and burned cars. The disruption was brief, but it showed how quickly violence can escalate and how visible it can be. Still, security experts say criminal groups are unlikely to disrupt the World Cup.
Quite the opposite. The influx of millions of tourists, that also is kind of like an economic boom for the criminal market.
David Mora is a security analyst with the International Crisis Group. He says criminal cartels usually don't target tourists because they bring business.
They consume drugs. They demand sex, which is also, another racket that criminal groups operate.
Also, he says criminal networks make money by extorting resorts, restaurants, and bars. So for both the government and the cartels, the World Cup is a chance to project safety on a global stage. And despite attacks like the one in Teotihuacan, Mexico remains one of the most visited countries in the world, welcoming millions of tourists each year. Most of them Americans. For The World, I'm Tibisay Sea, Mexico City.
Green energy has long been a talking point in conversations about the environment, economics, and national security. But with recent pressure around fossil fuel cost and consumption, solar panels and electric cars are demonstrating their value to countries across the globe in real time. Accordingly, green energy has also become a useful tool for developing soft power. Enter China with their low-cost green products, like solar panels and batteries, which have become hot commodities. The Poly Crisis podcast tracks the geopolitics of the energy transition, and especially China's role in that transition. When I caught up with co-host Kate McKenzie in Sydney, Australia, she spoke about her team's interest in that China angle.
It was something that was kind of creeping up in the energy world, but maybe hadn't quite attracted the attention that it really deserves. The country that we focus on in the first episode of our podcast is Pakistan, which has had this extraordinary expansion in solar power from, I think, 5 gigawatts to more than 40 gigawatts in just a couple of years.
So we'll hear more about the Pakistan example, but can you just give us a short list of some of the countries that China has been courting through renewable energy?
I mean, gosh, it's really a lot. I mean, I think Southeast Asian countries and Sub-Saharan African countries are probably some of the most interesting ones, but there's also some much bigger projects happening, even in Middle Eastern countries, even like some of the oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. A lot of European countries as well, not just developing countries. Spain, for example, has now got so much solar power deployed that they're somewhat insulated from the natural gas price shocks that are coming from this Middle East war.
How much assistance has Spain gotten from China when it comes to renewables and green energy?
Well, this is the thing. It's not really China actually directly assisting countries so much when it comes to solar panels, battery storage, EVs. It's really this kind of side effect, as we call it, of China's own industrial policy, its own economic strategy, and its own economic security strategy. Well over a decade ago, China, for various reasons to do with its own economic model, decided that it wanted to become a leader in manufacturing things like EVs, solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, among other things. These were identified as emerging industries where China could be a leader rather than a follower. And that's exactly what's happened.
Let's focus on the example of Pakistan, which you do in your first episode. In the last few years, Pakistan has undergone what's been called one of the fastest transitions to solar in the world. So first off, what was going on in Pakistan to spur this? What made green energy appealing there?
You'll remember that in early 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, end of February, early March, that sent world oil and natural gas markets into a sort of similar-ish state to what we're seeing now. Prices went very high. Some countries like Pakistan had developed a real dependence on importing this liquefied natural gas. They had been running out, their own reserves of natural gas had been running low, and it led to blackouts, and that then led to this taking advantage of the proliferation of cheap solar panels that were very easy to export.
And what was China's role in facilitating that transition?
The state of China was not particularly active in that at all. It was really this proliferation of companies making cheaper and cheaper solar panels, in particular in China, and just needing to sell them because, that's what companies have to do. And enterprising Pakistani businesses and householders and even, villagers would sort of clubbing together and just importing them.
Importing those solar panels from China, though, right?
Exactly, from China, because China makes most of them now.
So for the Polycrisis podcast, Kate, you spoke with Hania Issad from the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis in Pakistan. I want us to hear an excerpt from that conversation where she describes the prevalence of solar energy now in Pakistan.
Everybody has solar. If you go towards the agricultural sector, you will realize how much it has benefited people. It has led to very, very innovative business models where communities are sharing batteries and solar to irrigate their fields, to pump out water, to meet their energy needs. And this is all productive use of energy. In, desert areas which are not connected to the grid at all, people now have access to internet. They can charge their phones. They've got, lighting at night, which they did not have before.
She really paints a picture of how big an impact this has on people's lives. It's not just a new source of energy. It's changing day-to-day life. Hey, Kate, how does that translate to political leverage for China in their pursuit of green energy, soft power?
I think it is just another element of the, increasing presence of China in a lot of these countries. When you've already got, in some countries, some very big infrastructure partnerships with China around roads, logistics, resources and mining. I think this kind of new energy connection is just another element of that. It's interesting, it is starting to save money for some of these countries. There is some research indicating that Pakistan's saved about $12 billion so far.
Wow.
Just from having more solar capacity, which means it needs to import less LNG. And LNG is an expensive kind of power to import.
I mean, the way you've described it, Kate, it sounds like China is wielding soft power mixed with a capitalist incentive to reap huge profits from selling solar panels and battery storage. So how different really is this soft power that China is acting on?
Yeah, look, it's such a side effect. It's what economists might call a positive externality. The goal of the Chinese state, the government there, like any government in any country, is to stay in power or maintain legitimacy. And to do that, they need economic growth. Exporting more and more valuable goods, more and more sophisticated goods, is part of their strategy to do that. China has a lot of different strings to its diplomatic bow. There's many initiatives, partnerships around the world, things like education, research, technology, collaboration, trade. But the green energy stuff, they haven't really had to push very hard on that. They haven't had to offer countries financing. These things just kind of sell themselves.
Kate McKenzie is one of the hosts of a podcast called Polycrisis. She joined the show from Sydney, Australia.
We've spoken on the show about the wide-reaching impacts of the U.S. and Israeli war on Iran. Gas shortages, a spike in the cost of fertilizer, even talk of a price hike on condoms. Another ripple effect, a reshaping of relationships in the Caucasus. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey are nations long divided by closed borders, bitter disputes, and war. Now, though, they are showing signs of cooperation with plans to reopen key trade routes. From Istanbul, Inside Europe's Dorian Jones reports on the real promise these proposals hold.
Addressing the European Parliament last month, the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said momentum is building for a new trade route with neighbouring Azerbaijan, driven in part by conflict unfolding across the border in the Middle East. The push follows a US-brokered peace deal last August to reconcile the countries after decades of conflict and reopen key transit routes. Months on, their shared border with Iran is giving both countries a fresh incentive to cooperate, according to Richard Giragosyan, director of the Regional Studies Center, a think tank based in the Armenian capital, Yerevan.
This war in Iran has fostered much more of a localized regional identity, where Armenia, Turkey, Azerbaijan are actually banding together, if you will, in terms of a restoration of regional identity based on self-sufficiency. Now is the one opportunity for consolidating regional connectivity in terms of trade and transport.
For more than 3 decades, the land border between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been closed after ethnic Armenians seized control of the Nagorno-Karabakh region in 1993, which is internationally recognized as Azerbaijani territory. In 2023, Azeri forces regained control of the contested territory. Reconciliation efforts are now accelerating and starting to bear fruits, explains Hikmet Hachiev, Foreign Affairs Advisor to Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev.
We are taking very courageous steps to stimulate regional interaction, cooperation, and we are doing the certain things that can be considered impossible just maybe 6 months ago.
In March, Turkish Airlines took to the skies connecting Istanbul and Yerevan once more, as part of a broader push to mend ties. Ankara had shuttered its border and cut diplomatic relations in 1994, standing with Azerbaijan. Now, according to Aslı Aytaşbaş, who leads the Turkey project at the Washington-based think tank, the Brookings Institution, the US-Israeli war with Iran is fueling Turkey's ambitions to expand its regional sway and giving Europe a fresh chance to look beyond the Middle East for its oil supplies.
If you look at the map of Turkey, the importance of the South Caucasus region becomes very obvious from a map as a new Silk Road. I think Turkey can open its border with Armenia and think of an alternative route, an alternative geopolitical opening from Europe all the way into Central Asia.
As Europe looks to reduce its reliance on Middle Eastern fossil fuels amid soaring fuel prices, attention is turning to Central Asia's vast oil and gas reserves, says Tatiana Matrova, a research fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at New York's Columbia University. But, Matrova warns, serious obstacles remain given the huge investment that will be required to build new pipelines.
I totally believe that there will be a lot of discussions about middle corridor and a lot of rhetorics, both in the region and in Europe. But frankly, I do not believe that it will materialize in any significant scale. The cost of transportation is very high, too many risks and too low margins.
The Caucasus, caught between the fires of Russia's war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, is facing real uncertainty over the feasibility of any new fossil-based energy corridor to Europe. Doubts linger over the economic and environmental rationale for investing billions of euros into fossil fuels, just as Europe moves towards phasing them out. Cooperation could be vital in resisting feared future threats from a Russia seeking to reassert itself in the region. However, it could be such Russian threats to the region's stability that ultimately prove too great an obstacle for any large-scale infrastructure investments by Europe. Dorian Jones, Istanbul.
Dorian's story comes to us from the DW podcast Inside Europe.
This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. In Spain, hundreds of thousands of immigrants now have a pathway to legalize their status in the country. The program started on Monday. 50,000 people have already signed up, but it is controversial and off to a rocky start, with long lines at immigration centers, even lawsuits. The World's Jerry Haddon reports from Barcelona.
Several hundred immigrants wait in a line that circles an entire city block downtown. It's noon and the sun is beating down, but 32-year-old Imam Hassan brushes it off. He says it's much hotter back home in Bangladesh.
How long have you been in the line today?
Almost 3 hours in here. It's too long. Yesterday midnight until yesterday morning, but minimum 5,000 people behind.
Hassan is one of around 800,000 immigrants who came to Spain illegally but who could still get Spanish papers. That's thanks to an amnesty decree in January by Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez.
Mucho gracias, Sánchez Pedro, Prime Minister. Thank you so much.
Hassan came to Spain 2 years ago, he says, on a tourist visa and stayed.
May I ask why you came to Spain?
Because it's a bright future in here, and I'm a Spanish chef. Before, I'm working in Malaysia as a Spanish chef.
Hassan carries a plastic folder bulging with papers, his passport, a criminal background check, some utility bills. It's everything he could think of, he says, just in case, because there's been confusion about just how to prove you qualify for the amnesty. As we're talking, a worried-looking elderly woman walks over, hands me a handwritten note.
This woman has a note in Spanish asking for help how to get her residency permit. You have to wait in this long line, I'm afraid.
No habla español. No habla English, no habla. Esto no aquí.
The woman just shrugs at me and says, I don't speak Spanish or English. Then she's gone. It's a pretty chaotic scene here, and at hundreds of makeshift amnesty centers set up in post offices and other government buildings. In the first 3 days of the program, around 50,000 people have queued up across Spain. Here in Barcelona, some local residents watch on, curious and alarmed.
¿Cómo absorbemos todo esto? Es que no sé. Porque vale, son todas las personas tienen derecho.
Can we absorb so many people? A Spanish man asks out loud. He won't give his name, but he says he lives just around the corner. These immigrants are all human beings, he says, with a right to a safe place to live. But public services are already maxed out, he says. Our public health care, education. It's not the immigrants' fault, he says. It's our corrupt politicians who steal everything. Speaking of stealing, the crowds of immigrants have attracted all manner of scammers and con artists. They've been seen working these lines, promising to handle people's paperwork and appointments for a fee of about $75. Today, there's no sign of them, maybe because the press is around, but online they've been busy. Local journalist Uriel Soleil, speaking on radio station Cadena Ser, explains that it's illegal to charge people for setting up appointments with government agencies. But he says immigrants often don't know this, and they're anxious, he says, thinking, if I can just get this right, my life is going to really change. So they're easy prey, he says, for smooth talkers offering help. As police investigate the amnesty mafias, as they call them, the government's been trying to stamp out fake news online, like the program's over, or Venezuelans don't qualify. Another, saying Ukrainian refugees could not get residency papers, went viral this month. This is a government video on TikTok refuting that.
Por ejemplo, si llegaste a España como desplazado por el conflicto en Ucrania y dispones de una autorización de residencia...
If you came to Spain to escape the conflict in Ukraine on a temporary visa, says a young man, this new legalization program is not for you. But you already have another track to residency, he assures them. Please don't listen to the rumors, he implores. It appears the government has put that fire out, and another. A near revolt by staff at the immigration processing centers. The government employees say they were already overworked before this crush of applications. They called off a planned strike for this Monday at the last minute in return for hefty raises. But there's one threat to Sanchez's amnesty that he can't nip in the bud: lawsuits. Sanchez passed his immigrant legalization by decree, skirting an almost certain no vote in Congress. As a short-term play, it worked, but under Spanish law, decrees can be challenged in court. Among those speaking out against the program's legality is government critic and conservative leader of the Madrid region, Isabel Díaz Ayuso.
Yo lo que defiendo es la ley y el orden, pero nada más que eso, la ley y el orden, la organización.
I'm a defender of law and order, she said in a speech criticizing the amnesty measure last week. We need to know who these people are, she said, and where they come from. What problems are they bringing with them, and can they be integrated or not? Qualifying immigrants have until June 30th to apply for their papers. That's a tight window. But if Spain's constitutional court annuls the program before that, it's over, right then and there. So immigrants are potentially racing against two clocks, which helps explain the big crowds of applicants these first few days. In line in Barcelona is José Luis Espitia, an older gentleman and a former bank manager from Colombia.
En el proceso del asilo se hizo todo el procedimiento, fue denegado, se presentó el recurso.
I've been turned down twice here for political asylum, he says. If I can just legalize my status, I'd be motivated to start doing something with my life. Pedro Sanchez has called this amnesty program humane and practical. Getting hundreds of thousands of workers onto tax rolls would boost the federal budget. It would also send a larger message to the rest of Europe, where most governments are calling for tighter borders and more deportations, that immigrants are not a problem, they're an asset. For The World, I'm Jerry Haddon, Barcelona.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. Find us online anytime at theworld.org. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. luminafoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Renee Vacchio-Albi, Roman Mars, the Kelson Foundation, and the Ken and Lucy Lehman family. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.